Welcome, welcome. This is Union of Ideas broadcasting webinar. We are recording and we are live on Facebook. Today is January 26, 2021. I am Eva Ellis. I will be recording this. I'll be coordinating this episode on the backstage, and I am really recording. And I will meet you back by the end of the recording for open discussion. Now it's my pleasure to pass the screen to my dear friend, Katerina.
Great. Thank you so much, Eva. Everybody, welcome to tonight's session on the myths of hospice care. We're really excited to have you joining us. But before we begin, if you want to know a little bit more about us, we here at Union of Ideas are a team of 4 volunteers, and we met through Toronto Philosophy. As shown in the video, we have touched upon Ursula Franklin's idea of human technology. So when we think of human technology, we normally think in today's modern time, we usually relate to like all of our devices and stuff like that, and the software programs we use. However, Ursula's definition of technology is based on the skills, the talents, crafts that we have developed as humans. So tonight, 2 of our other Union of Ideas volunteers, Joel and James, who will be our panelists, and we'll be having a conversation with our guest speaker for the next 45 minutes. During this time, I will be monitoring the chat section along with the Q&A feature, which will also be recorded. Please feel free to post your questions and comments, and we'll be answering them in the live recording. Evan and I will leave for now, and without further ado, Joe, I'll pass it over to you.
How's it going, everybody? My name is Joel Garland, and I'm a new member of Union of Ideas. And basically, what we've been looking for the past few months is a new guest that started off the new year properly to interview. So there's a little bit of a backstory of how I came across Rami Shami. One of my good friends who is just so happens to be a volunteer at Hospice Barrie, one evening sat me down and encouraged me to watch this amazing presentation by Rami about racism, which was titled The Continuum from Cultural Humility to Anti-Racism Within Grief Support. And it was well over an hour long, but within easily 30 seconds, I was immediately sucked into his whole presentation and found it just so incredibly powerful and enlightening. So I reached out to him, and he said yes, he'd absolutely love to be a part of this group. So Rami Shami is his life work involves holistic hospice palliative care. He has well over 3 decades of experience that goes back to when he was volunteering at age 19. He's won dozens upon dozens of awards that include Hospice of Peel, Heart House Hospice in-home volunteer, Special Events Coordinator, as well as Mississauga Civic Award of Recognition of 2005, and Director of Community and Volunteer Services through Dorothy Lay Hospice. His consulting program gives a number of resources listed off in cultural humility, the art of communication, empathy development, compassionate leadership, and respecting boundaries. And his life motto, I learned that every mortal will taste death, but only some will taste life. So with further ado, I'd really love to introduce Rami Shami on with us.
Why, thank you, Joel. Thank you for that introduction. But I believe that quote, although it's a motto that I might have adopted, but I believe that quote was Rumi. I believe. Anyways, it's on the website. Good evening, folks. On this snowy evening.
Welcome, Rami.
Thank you.
Rami, I just so glad to have you here. I mean, we're talking about human technology, and technology meaning how we do things. 1,000 years ago, technology was manual, and then at the time Ursula Franklin was born, it was mainly mechanical, and now it's electronic. But it's fundamentally a mindset that leads us to all of these discoveries. And it really, what you do is in that mindset that you have is something that will, eventually benefit all of us, and I think that's the excitement of having you, you hear and sharing in your experience. And so glad to have you on. I'm just wondering if maybe you could just outline for the audience, how hospice care works, here in Southern Ontario, but maybe, elsewhere in the world, maybe some differences, but just, kind of, if you can maybe just kind of give people the overview of the art of what you do.
I appreciated that word, James. You used the term art because definitely it is an art form, serving individuals who are living with a life-limiting illness, regardless of the setting and regardless of the trajectory of illness, is an art form. And you mentioned something. If you wouldn't mind, if I could frame it a little bit differently, when you talked about mindset. What we bring to the work, I call it the entering. What we enter into this work is really our whole selves. There's definitely a perception and a mindset, but there can be also, or most definitely is, an existential, spiritual, even physical, visceral, psychological, environmental domains, the domains that engage in this work. It's one of the most beautiful aspects that really catalyze or emphasize entering your own life so that you could enter someone's dying. And that's what's fulfilled me for the past, 3 decades has been. Thank you for the reminder, Joel. To give you a little bit of an oversight or overview of what hospice palliative care is in Ontario, and I'm going to speak about it in Ontario. Currently, I serve as a case manager at Kensington Health. I support caregiver groups and the bereavement program, but I'm also a consultant, and I also serve with as a multicultural outreach coordinator with the Lighthouse for Grieving Children. And I teach in a lot of different hospices. So I'm really fortunate to have seen how what would be termed hospice palliative care today evolve over the past 30 years, and evolve in so many different ways. Evolve from the depth and capacity of programming, evolve in who we serve and how we serve them, and even evolve in the model of engagement. We used to address it as hospice, and through the years, we started reconfiguring who and what we serve and address it as hospice palliative care, because there is this misconception that they're so different. Palliative care and hospice, they can be quite unique and different, but they can be an amalgamation or even an intersection of what would be called transdisciplinary supports. But hospice palliative care really is an approach, folks. Like it's not a time frame. It's not a place, it's an approach, and it's an approach that involves certain aspects of care. For example, psychosocial, spiritual aspects, addressing loss and grief, anticipatory and post-death in a state of bereavement. It is addressing what's Dame Cicely Saunders called the totality of symptomatology, or total pain, meaning mental, emotional, spiritual, environmental, existential pain. And the trajectory of illness isn't as important in hospice palliative care as the approach is. And it's the approaches that define how the care is provided. Yes, I mean, somebody technically will be categorized as receiving a palliative approach if they have a life-limiting illness that's going to progressively take their own life. But it doesn't mean tomorrow or in 2 days or in 6 months. I mean, some hospice palliative care programs are 1 or 2 years, 3 years in service, even 4 years. And depending on the hospice and depending on the geography in Ontario. Technically, hospice palliative care has it used to have 2 main settings until the great work by Dr. Dahin Dusani kind of blew the cover off of it. So technically, hospice palliative care is a community program. It's based in the home, right? Based in people's homes in the communities. But then home has a different definition, especially as we address it today, as Dr. Dusani and the PhD in palliative education and care for the homeless started to address where home really is for people, which means traditionally homelessness or structural vulnerability, which can be on the streets of anywhere in this province. And then there's a hospice residence, right, where it's a place where people come to spend or live their last 3 to 4 months, and their beds, funded by the public, through fundraising and funded by the government. So you have really different locations, but really I'm very fortunate right now because I work in a hospice, I work in the community, but I also work in a long-term care facility. And that is really where a lot of hospice palliative care is being supported, or a lot of palliative care is being supported, because long-term care has the majority of people are living with some form of life-limiting illness. So they are receiving a palliative approach. So if I could just summarize that, what hospice palliative care is, it's an approach. It's an approach to serving people living with a progressive life-limiting illness.
Very well put.
Thank you, Joel.
And you're working with the patients themselves, but also, I guess, volunteers, family, caregivers. So you're working with a host of people, I guess.
Yeah, if I may just, James, if you wouldn't mind, I'm just going to reword something, just because language is so powerful. It's so important, right? So we don't traditionally address people in hospice palliative care as patients. Patients is a term that doesn't afford the autonomy and advocacy that what hospice palliative care is founded on. So hospice palliative care usually addresses people receiving its service as an individual served, a person, or by their name, or a client or a resident. We don't associate too much with the term patient because of the model of care. It's a technicality that we feel the term patient means that you are not directing your care. The medical team or clinical team is directing your care. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the beauty about hospice palliative care is it's so community-based that it needs and utilizes volunteer support. That's a plus and a negative, and then I'll tell you why. Having people represented in the hospice to serve their community is a very powerful sense of community and coming together and building resources. But in times like COVID, it stresses how we can't have volunteers at bedside in the residence. We can't have volunteers in the community serving people in their homes. So what happens to a lot of the programming if they're volunteer dependent? And then you add the funding piece, which most hospices are 40 to 50% fundraised. Then you run into some challenges, which we're running into right now because, just most members of society may not have the disposable income to support a hospice.
Rami, if you'll let me ask, you said you've been doing this since you were 19 years of age.
Like when I had hair, Joel.
Yeah. The question I want to put to you is, I have a lot of family members and friends who are on the front lines, who are healthcare workers. And on top of all of the incredible hours that they're working and the stress that comes with that, ultimately they see a lot of people passing away and dying. And that experience itself can be very traumatic for, especially for your first time nurses or physicians, for example. So for somebody in your case going into that at 19 years of age, was that in any way stressful from the very beginning that took a lot of effort to overcome, or was that more or less like sort of a natural, beautiful way of framing it? I don't know. Like, was it a negative experience at first?
No, Joel. So I rare, unless I'm supporting a client or a resident or family member that says passing on or passed over, I usually just use the term and they call it what it is, death and dying, right? I was drawn and calling to this work. An intuition, an innate resonance with the work. So I've never felt like I've been taken by death and dying or grief and bereavement or what have you. There's definitely a traumatizing aspect to it, no doubt, right? And that doesn't have to necessarily equate to acute, sudden, violent, or suffering-induced and pain exercised deaths. It can be just watching somebody peacefully die can be traumatizing. But death and dying, especially as 75 to 80% of us in Canada will experience of a life-limiting illness, it's a very natural course of life. I mean, it's very natural. I mean, we are all going to do it, right? And not to minimize the impact it has on the community or the individuals that are supporting or part of the family structure, however they define family. It's what we do. It is guaranteed what we do. And once that realization, that's a lot of my teaching and work right now, is the awareness of our mortality. It's an awareness of impermanence, right? It is the fact that this is what happens to us. And what happens to us when we're dying. And when we recognize that it's a natural course of our lives, it may lessen the traumatizing aspect of it. Yeah, sure. If it's the first time you even, like, let me reframe this, Joel. If it's the first time you even think you can die, absolutely it can be traumatizing, right?
Mhm.
But I've raised my child as a 9-year-old, and I was fortunate enough to get in this when I was, 19, to recognize this is a natural process of our lives, and in that self-reflection and that self-awareness and that contemplation on our mortality and at any age, that comes with it a sense of awareness or understanding, and a lack of fear and anxiety at times if it's trained properly and brought to awareness in a sensitive way, that it dilutes the traumatizing aspect of it. So no, and in hospice palliative care, we do exceptional training, especially for volunteers,
Mhm.
to prepare them for what they might experience at bedside, right? What can it look like? What are some things that are normal part of dying? So for someone who doesn't know that we naturally have our body shut down and don't feel like eating or drinking towards pretty much at any time during the life-limiting journey, it can be traumatizing for somebody to think that that's not normal. That's not the case. It's normalizing aspects of dying, and also recognizing what does grief feel like? What is certain reactions that we normally experience into the bereavement state? How do we navigate loss? Because loss is happening all the time, and it's not necessarily death related. I wish, hey man, if they're going to teach sex ed and they're going to teach iPads, they're going to teach finances, they're going to teach about Trump in schools, let's teach about grief and bereavement. Let's teach about death and dying as well, right? Because it happens at any age.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
It's actually, if I could frame this just a little bit more, it is actually fueled my life. It is, I get burnt out by bureaucracy and hierarchy and microaggressions in HR. I never have approached burnout as a consequence of sitting with people who are taking their last breaths, or watching and being present for somebody who's living with a life-limiting illness. Sorry, James, go ahead.
No, I was going to just ask. I mean, you mentioned, like, I'm just wondering, like, over time, how has the approach changed? Are people more willing to talk about, the process of death and dying now than they were before? And I know when we met with you last week to prepare for this week's episode, you talked about the cultural diversity in Southern Ontario, and I think you talked about some of the issues and good things about navigating that diversity as well. And I was just wondering, like, over time and in dealing with the diversity, how has that sort of evolved?
Yeah, those are two, although they interface and interlace, they're two kind of separate conversations. But let's look at the evolution of death care, right? Absolutely, James. I mean, there's been, how when death is starting to be represented in its authentic, if you can call TV programming and movies authentic, but when it starts to being represented in movies and television, like Criminal Minds, like Lost, like Breaking Bad, when it's represented there, it's starting to break the social norms and the social phobias, right? We're still, I believe, in a death aversive, death denying society, just from the very fact that most of our funding for healthcare goes to hospital settings and hospital and life-saving measures, rather than addressing an aspect of our life's journey that is absolute, which is death and dying. So there's been a lot, especially in the past 10 years, there's been a lot more awareness and comfort and understanding and engagement of death and dying, not just practices, but conversations, right? And that's reflected in almost explosion of death care schools, right? What we call death doulas, thanadoulas, end-of-life doulas. And I teach in a number of schools as such. And with the volume of people coming to learn and study end-of-life care and what have you. So yeah, there is, I can't really say, James, why that's happening. It's just maybe the necessity. I mean, we are in an aging demographic, which doesn't necessarily equate to increases in people being served by hospice palliative care, because our hospice just a few weeks ago had the majority of people in it under 40. So end of life or hospice palliative care is not an older adult engagement. And to couple that with, if we're going to speak a little bit about diversity, Southern Ontario, in my humble opinion, is the most diverse geography in the world. We have, 190, 192 dialects spoken in Southern Ontario, people coming from all over the world.
Wow.
We have Indigenous peoples. Yeah, Joel. We have the Indigenous peoples, which we probably should have started today with a land acknowledgement, but it might not be too late. We have Indigenous peoples, we have immigration, we have refugees, we have an influx of our Southern partners coming up as they, we won't get too much into that. These aspects create a great deal of diversity, and they all in some way interface with end-of-life care or hospice palliative care, because they're not necessarily equate to one. End of life is just an aspect of hospice palliative care. And then you add the intergenerational piece. First generation, second generation, third generation immigrants. And then, which I find, and we talked about this last week, James, you add, the affliction that affects almost 100% of Canadians, which is trauma or traumatization in some capacity. And then you put the cherry on top, which is social media and news and education. So you get quite a potpourri of rich diversity engaging death care. And in Southern Ontario, really, I find, if not more towards even, Ontario in general, really, is the perfect melting pot to study and to be a part of death care, especially today. And I know I want to be sensitive to the pandemic and COVID. I work a lot with the whole pandemic piece and providing caregiver support. I think even with the pandemic, James, you were talking about how it draws out the topic of death and dying. I think that's been the biggest catalyst nowadays to talk about advanced care planning, to talk about hospice palliative care, to talk about end-of-life wishes, to talk about even our vulnerability and mortality.
Well, Rami, you also mentioned diversity. So with all of that being said, with hospice care being in Southern Ontario and all the technology available to us and moving this forward, how on earth were you able to tie racism into this? Because that's how I originally stumbled upon you. Like your message behind that was just, it made me feel so uncomfortable in a good way. Like I'm still wrapping my head around like what your overall message was with that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm a Canadian, but my parents are from the Middle East. My dad's from Israel. My mom's from Lebanon. And, with a name like Rami Shami and an unibrow entering a predominantly Anglo-European model of care at a very young age, I have to say it wasn't easy, right? It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy being male in the field. It wasn't easy being Middle Eastern Canadian male in the field. There's still a lot of racism in hospice palliative care. It is basically
That's incredible. That's hard to believe.
Joel, I mean, how can I say? It is a if you were served by hospice palliative care, especially 10 years ago, you were very lucky, because hospices were predominantly, it's changed now, especially by the work of Dr. Nahid Hassani and his group. Hospice palliative care, because of its funding model, meaning it's 50% fundraised by a community, they cannot exist in communities that are of any other income than upper middle class. And predominantly the upper middle class communities in Ontario were of a particular demographic. And when you have those demographics, you're going to be serving a particular population, and you're going to have people serving that particular population. And until very recently, where hospices are now opening in Scarborough, and hospice palliative care is being brought to the streets of Toronto with the Peach program, and being pulled out and to serve certain Indigenous peoples and what have you. It was predominantly an Anglo-European model. And even the model of hospice palliative care, it was projected and expected of all these other dimensions of diversity, which is not necessarily ethnicity and country of origin. We're talking LGBTQ plus as well, to assume that this model works for everybody. And if it doesn't work for you, well, you're SOL. You find something else to support you. So recently, and recently I say in the past 5 to 7 years, there's been a lot of work done by Hospice Palliative Care Ontario to change our model of engagement for a more culturally humble approach that's infused with anti-oppression and anti-racism, especially this past year, so that we can serve other populations and other diversities and other measures of inclusivity and equity if they so choose, because there's always that autonomy piece in there. We have to look at our model. Like, is this model of having a hospice residence and these domains of care and this model of care steeped in its Anglo-European background, is this what will serve who's coming to Canada and who is already in Canada and who's indigenous to Canada? That's where we're challenged right now. So yes, I did experience a great deal of racism. I mean, Toronto is pretty diverse, but you don't have to step outside of Toronto to see that communities are still very monodemographic and not necessarily welcoming to someone with a rhyming name like mine.
Yeah.
And especially, Joel, if I can add to it, if you try to change management is very difficult, especially for rooted ideologies, right? This is where I want to speak just a little bit to Lighthouse for Grieving Children, because they brought me on board as a multicultural outreach coordinator, but they've been really progressive in an anti-racism, anti-oppression approach. They have brought, training to their board, as through myself, in anti-racism and cultural humility. They've been progressive in cultural humility practices well before today's expression of Black Lives Matter, which unfortunately it's seen as an anomaly and it's only today. Whereas and in that regard, there's still a lot of work to be done within the social sector, but specifically with hospice palliative care. Although death hits us all, we do not all die the same, and I mean that from a service standpoint.
I mean, that's powerful.
What can we do to deliver that kind of good high standard of care at that point in people's lives? You spoke about the problem is that it's only available to certain communities based on higher incomes. Is there like one single thing that we should really focus on to break down those barriers and deliver that standard of care to a wider number of people? And I was wondering too, are we looking at like whether it's in Ontario or elsewhere, are we looking at best practices elsewhere, and are we picking up on, are different jurisdictions communicating with each other and this sort of thing?
There is a considerable amount of knowledge sharing, James, across the province, even across the country and in the U.S., even across the world, because I've been very fortunate to be part of some programs. For example, the Cora Palliative Care Unit in Trinidad and Tobago, right? So there is, and especially even with, for example, I'm very proud that in Montreal we host, the International Palliative Care Conference, where people come from all over the world. So yes, there is some aspects of knowledge sharing. That being said, if hospice palliative care was truly, and this is a reflection I feel on society, if hospice palliative care was truly going to be an equitable, inclusive, diverse service, we would be fully funded. All right, we're not fully funded. When you leave a form of healthcare up to the people to fundraise for it, then the people will do what they can. That means a lot of people who can't afford it, can't afford to fundraise, or can't afford to have good hospice palliative care services in their community, won't receive it. So it even starts there. So if we really want to start something, we want to start at funding, right? Enough money put towards programming that is diverse, inclusive, and equitable, however we define those within hospice palliative care, to serve the public in the measure that they would receive the service, right? And that's an important piece, is how it would be received. The receivership is a very important piece. Right now, it's not like that. Right now, it's like we have these services, and if it works for you, great. And if it doesn't, that's the challenge. Let's fully fund hospice palliative care service. Let's look at, you said it, James, beautifully. Let's look at best practice models. Is freestanding hospices, meaning residences, are they the best model when they only serve between 120 and 200 people a year? And yet in a community the size of Kitchener or Waterloo, you'll probably have 2,000 people die of a life-limiting illness in a year. So let alone Toronto, right? I didn't pick Toronto because we have so many palliative care units. We're really saturated in terms of palliative care beds. And let's look at the social determinants of health, who will receive hospice palliative care services, and the awareness even of the services there. So if English isn't your first language, or if you're don't have access to internet or Zoom, or there's so many aspects to it. I think if there was just one thing we could focus on, James, if I was Prime Minister of Canada, I would focus on funding hospice. Let's just start with funding hospice palliative care fully.
So is it a mindset then? I'm just thinking, I mentioned mindset at the beginning as kind of the driver of technology, and technology is our art and our practices. And so is it a mindset of we're funding people to restore them to health, but when we can't restore them to health, the mindset just doesn't provide the funding? Is it a mindset sort of like that?
Well, you know what, James? Let's absolutely expand on mindset. How do you define health? The mindset of what is health. And I can tell you the mindset of what is health in hospice palliative care is very different at times than the mindset of what would the general public define health. Because there's health and there's well-being, right? Just because the body is healthy or the body is not healthy doesn't mean there's a lack of health. Doesn't mean there's a lack of well-being, psychosocial, spiritually, existentially, however you define, religiously. I've had the privilege and the honor to sit with individuals who are dying, and they are in much better psychosocial, emotional, spiritual health than most of us, right? So how do we define health? And that's where the dollars go. You're right, it is a mindset. It is a definition of what is health. And now we're fortunate enough that there's a lot of advocacy for mental health, because that wasn't even on the map 10, 15, 20 years ago, right? How to the extent it is now. So, and I believe hospice palliative care, and I say this in all arrogance, is that I think it could change the world, because it forces us to start looking at how do we define health. Just because you have a life-limiting illness, just because you're dying, does not mean you are healthy on some level. And some of those levels of health, in some people's eyes and perceptions, including my own, may be more important than physical health.
Rami, this would probably be more of a statement than a question, but this has been so educational on so many levels. I hardly knew a thing about hospice or palliative care before you came on, but you have volumes and layers of very unique and powerful, beautiful perspectives you put onto this, because you're in a line of work that involves death. You're able to tie racism into it, and you turn so many taboo things into such a beautiful, inviting arena for people to come in and just be more open to talk about, so to speak. So it's like you have a very unique, powerful advantage, and I just would encourage that all day and night. It's incredibly beautiful.
I appreciate it, Joel. May I expand on that just a little bit? Not expand on the beauty, but if there's anything I've learned, it's from the people I've sat with and been with. So that's the gift. That's the gift that every single one of us can achieve. If you engage in the field, volunteerism, advocacy, learning, there's so much that can be gained that doesn't necessarily require a PhD or a doctorate or physician or clinical practice. It's right there. It is one of the most natural aspects that holds community together is death care. How do we care for our dying really speaks, and I know somebody quoted this, somebody more brilliant than I am, really speaks to how healthy a society is, right? And where our resources go. So anything I've learned, anything I am sharing with you, it is certainly not my own. It is what I've learned at the bedside. It is what I've learned serving people living and dying of life-limiting illnesses in all different settings, long-term care, hospices, on the streets of Toronto with Dr. Naheed Hassan and his team, and Sasha Hill and what have you. It's what we've learned, and the honor and privilege of receiving that from them, the learnings from them, makes us look smart, makes us look intelligent and intellectual. But we really didn't come up with any of this. It's what we've learned. And that's the beauty of the work, Joel. That is the true beauty of the gift of all this work. And that's what can inspire a change in mindset, James. A lot of times, if I could speak, folks, many of us run out of the burning building, meaning away from somebody who's living with a life-limiting illness or dying of such. And I don't mean figuratively walking out of the room. I mean, we can check out emotionally, physically. Sorry, not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically, mentally. We create a buffer and distance ourselves from it. Just tell anybody that you're not well, or listen to somebody talk about their disease process, and that's right away. We say something sometimes kind of like, "I'm sorry for your loss." We just disconnect from it, right? Whereas the true essence of it is actually to go into the burning building, to sit at bedside in the opportunities that are afforded in Ontario, which is a very rare opportunity. Not everywhere in the world do you have the opportunity to volunteer or learn or take a death doula program, or take programming on end of life and hospice palliative care. Go into the burning building, sit with it, be with it, and recognize how the reflective practice of being in the face of death focuses you on your own mortality. And when that happens, there's magic that can come forth from that. Magic in self-learning. And it's different, folks. I do want to say something. It's different than sitting with somebody that you love, or a partner or a spouse or a child who's dying. We're talking anonymous. We're talking where there is no vicarious connection with that person from a whatever the defined family perspective. It's the anonymous piece, to sit and be with death and dying, that can teach us so much about living.
Sorry, I think I disappeared from the screen there, I think, for a minute, but I just wanted to jump in, Rami. I mean, you talk very powerfully about the experiences that you get from sitting with people who are in that process, and I'm just wondering, is there something we can do technologically to share those experiences more widely? I mean, that kind of beauty of understanding that you spoke about. I mean, you asked us each a very powerful question last week near the end of our discussion, and you asked each of us how we would imagine a peaceful death. And I know what I said. I said two things: absence of pain and leaving no unfinished business. And I thought about the no unfinished business the next day. I mean, of course, you can never die, I guess, without unfinished business. But I think what I really meant was, making an account of myself, and just being able to go out knowing that I've, somehow I will persist in time. And that's what occurred to me the next day. And I just wondered what your thoughts on that are. Is that something that you're getting from the people that you're with?
James, you brought 3 or 4 brilliant points in there. Like, I don't know which one to start with. Like, thank you for that. So the question I asked actually wasn't so much a peaceful death, was a good death, because I feel, however we define a good death is actually judgment, right? Once we start defining a good death and projecting it onto someone else, then we assume that if they don't die the way we feel we should die, then it's not a good death. We could only define what would be good for us in the moment, right? In the moment, especially. James, you also mentioned the piece about holding ourselves accountable. I ask, why do we wait until we are actively dying to start holding ourselves accountable? The beautiful process that this has taught me of being with people, living with a life-limiting illness, is that to hold yourself accountable every day, every moment. That's part of living with the present. Living with the present isn't just, oh, I feel the desk and I feel my feet on the floor. It's holding yourself psychologically, mentally, emotionally accountable to all your actions. There's some great quotes by Viktor Frankl, Joel, about that, right? I can't quote it specifically. And I'll paraphrase. He said, in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he says, live your life as if you're going to make the mistake and you get a second chance to live it before you make that mistake, right? That is living with the whole aspect and perception and self-reflection of death and dying, James. And then to add the technology piece, if we want to start speaking to this technology piece, I think, not to be insensitive with the impact of COVID, no doubt, but COVID has forced us to look at technology, right? I'm sensitive about technology because there is an exclusion to technology, and that is a social economic, at times, exclusion. It could be exclusion due to demographics, access. But you're right, James. I mean, if we can start to really emphasize, advocate, and push technology, we can start to, and it's happening right now. Like right now, this is an opportunity to bring to a larger population and masses the learnings about death care, the learnings about hospice palliative care, the learnings about racism within such altruistic fields of service, right? I think social media has blown it up. I think part of the reason why death care has become a stronger message in the general public is because of social media. It's because of stories on social media. It's because of the advent of FaceTime and Zoom and YouTube, right? All these aspects of media relations have brought that learning to a large, like tonight we can reach across the country, across the world in a heartbeat. Last week I was on a Zoom call with Dr. Thistle, who runs a program in Zimbabwe, and we were talking about supporting him in some hospice palliative care endeavors within his hospital there. So there's knowledge that could be transferred very beautifully. How can media technology work in hospice palliative care? That's some of the beauty of it, right? When we're able to take an iPad or some device and have families from all over the world. And we're doing this right now with COVID, because we could only have 1 or 2 essential visitors in the room when somebody's dying because of COVID precautions, that we could, Zoom somebody in, FaceTime somebody in, so that they can be there with their loved one when they're living and dying. So there's all these aspects where there's an explosion of opportunity now within technology to bring that forth, and to bring even a sense of humanity and connection to people who are otherwise isolated or alone. And that's not without even talking, James, about the technology that's used within the sector itself. But that's limited by funding. And it's limited by accessibility of who can have access to it. Yeah, I mean, Toronto, we're pretty rich, right, in terms of what we can do. You go to Sudbury, you go to Timmins, you go to, it's not the same. It's not the same. It's not an equitable service, but there is an opportunity for technology to really blow the doors off of this. I'll give you another example. So you got me going, right? So some of the programs I teach in right now are national, if not international, and it's all by Zoom, right? So how the access, in some ways it's creating inaccessibility and exclusion, and in other ways it's creating a great deal of accessibility and inclusion. So it is an oscillation. But it has a great deal of potential, even greater potential now within hospice palliative care. One final point on that: there are even some apps now that talk about, hospices, hospice palliative care, what to expect when you're dying, advanced care planning. That's really exploded. So lots of potential.
With all of this ground we're covering, this is reminding me really well of a quote by Ursula Franklin, which I'll have James quote because he does it best. But everything from the technology side to hospice care to shedding more light and awareness and eliminating the taboo of death and racism. What was the quote, James, about the absence of fear, she said?
Yeah, the absence of fear, and she talked about peace because she was a Holocaust survivor, and she was all about humane technology, and again, it's the practice and the art of what we do, and she was fond of saying peace is not the absence of war, but the absence of fear, which is the presence of justice. And I think that's it's that absence of fear and the presence of justice that we're all seeking in life. And I think at the end of life, it should be present there more than ever, I would think, right?
Yeah, very well. But gentlemen, and Katerina and Eva, I do just this is negative. I do want to before we continue, I do want to do an land acknowledgement. I think we cannot talk about racism. We cannot talk about diversity and equity and inclusion. We can't talk about even death care without acknowledging the land that we are. I mean, technically, we are all in some way immigrants. So would you mind, I can read an acknowledgement at least for Toronto. Would that be all right? All right, folks. Anyways, we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of the many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeks and Chippewa and Haudenosaunee and Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I had the greatest honor and privilege to serve an individual who came to our hospice, who is Métis. And when you talk about racism and what have you, Joel, I think it's important to remember that, that the racism that we face, and the discrimination that we face, is not something that is isolated to Canada. It's something that is systemic. And we cannot we have to be mindful that, just sorry, I'm even stepping back, but this point just is really, really, I
Would you
emphasize.
mind if we can wrap it up in about 20 seconds or so, because we have to bring it to an end soon.
Oh, we do? Okay, no problem. This individual, as we served him in a culturally humble approach, we recognize how he wanted to engage his dying. It wasn't what we perceived Indigenous peoples to engage in death and dying.
And absolutely incredible. I'm sorry, we're just getting pinched with the time, but this,
No, by all means.
Rami, like, I really can't thank you enough for just gracing us with your presence and taking the time to talk to us and educate us on such matters, because like you've given us things to think about for years to come, honestly. But again, the fact that you're here just speaks volumes to us. So just thank you for giving us the time so much.
Thank you, Joel. I could go all night, so
I know
thank you.
You can. I'm not going to hold you to that for next time, but I want to take this opportunity to bring Katerina on the screen.
Sure.
There we go.
Sorry, I'm playing around here. Can you guys see me?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks so much. Rami, you have such great wealth and knowledge in the hospice care, and there are a couple of questions that people have posted in the chat section. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for the first part. Just to let you know, the recording has now concluded. And we're going to just take a quick 5-minute break, and we'll come back. And actually, this will be open to everybody, and especially the audience. Feel free to ask your questions, because Rami has brought up a lot of great points, and I'm sure we also have more questions that we'd like to ask them. So please come back. Just quickly, just to let you know, Union Ideas, we're fairly new, and I'm going to be posting us on our social media sites in the chat section. So if you want to come to more of these sessions, please do. Please follow us, because we're still babies in terms of getting followers. So we would really love for you to join us. So we will see you right now. It's 7:49. So let's say at 7:55, I'm giving 6 minutes instead of 5. we will come back and we will have an open discussion with Rami and the panelists. And Eva, I pass it on to you.
Yeah, see you at another episode of Union Ideas, friends. You can stay here at the same meeting. You don't need another link. This will be the same meeting. We are finishing up this episode with Rami's choice of a music video. What a choice, Rami. Thank you. Into the Mystic by Van Morrison. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Van Morrison, yeah.
Enjoy.
We were born before the wind, also younger than the sun. And the honeymoon was one as we sail into the mystic. I can now hear the sailors cry, smell the sea and feel the sky. Let your soul and spirit fly into the mystic. And where that foghorn blows, I will be coming home. Yeah, when the foghorn blows, I wanna hear it. I don't have to fear it, and I wanna rock your gypsy soul, just like way back in the days of old. And magnificently we will fold into the mystic.